The third main component of the process by which to become registered is examination. And this graphic kind of shows all of the different things that you need to study for and the topics that are going to be covered as part of the registration examination. Now, when we talk about the examination, it's kind of like the internship where any of the U.S. territories or jurisdictions or states can decide whatever they want to test on. But the majority and nearly all of the states have adopted the standardized registration exam. But that doesn't mean that that's the only thing that they'll test on. There are other exams that a state could choose to give, and that may depend on different items that are required in that state. So when we look at the majority of what's being tested, they're going to be similar topics like, this here says zoning or ADA, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, or contracts or cost estimation, and things that are common among all architectural projects. Those are things that are included in the standardized examination. The history of the exam process to become a registered architect is pretty interesting and has evolved a lot over the last several decades, because as experience has been required in different states or the majority of states, and as education has become required as part of the registration process, then the examination has evolved also. So depending on where you lived, the exam had been part of the process, but it might have been that your experience only plus the exam would lead to licensure, or perhaps the degree was introduced a bit later, or maybe it was that you had education plus a bit of experience and the exam, or maybe just the experience plus the exam. That was really common in a lot of states, where you would have a really lengthy amount of experience and perhaps you hadn't gone to architecture school, and then to kind of ensure that you were prepared to become licensed, then there was the exam at the end of the long experience period. So we've seen the exam evolve a lot, and this is a photo of actually landscape architects sitting for an exam, but the architect registration exam worked a lot the same way until not too long ago, really until about 20 years ago, where it was held a couple of times a year, usually in cities. So, if you lived in a small town or you lived, out in a rural area, you'd find out when the test was going to be offered. Usually once every 6 months, you'd attend those few days that it was offered, and then you would take all of the parts of the exam all together over about a 2 to 3 day period. And so this is a written portion of the exam that's being shown in this photo, but there's also a drawing portion of the exam, and it was a manual drawing and drafting portion of the exam, and everyone is sitting in the same room taking the same exact test. And so from what I understand, it was pretty nerve-wracking, because somebody would get to a certain part of the test and you could tell by what they were drawing that they were further ahead than you. But it's not unlike the current bar exam to become an attorney, where it's offered a couple of times a year. Now the exam process is very different. It's a computerized, standardized exam, and you can take different parts of the test at different times, not necessarily in any particular order. And if you want to take them all together, you can. If you want to spread them out over a series of months or weeks or years, you can do that also. But typically, you're at a testing center where, it would be pretty rare that there's even someone taking the architect exam at the same time as you are. The current version of the architect registration exam is referred to as ARE 4.0, and usually we just call the exam ARE because it stands for Architect Registration Examination. And ARE 4.0, this is kind of like the fourth version of this, standardized computerized exam. Now, ARE 5.0 is going to be coming out in 2016, so very soon. The exam process will switch over, the fee structure will change, the preparation for the exam will change, some of the categories will be combined with others, so there will actually be some different strategies for taking the exam. But when you hear ARE, it's Architect Registration Exam or Examination, and 4.0 is the current version of the exam. Now, ARE 4.0 has 7 divisions or 7 parts. What that means is there are 7 separate tests. So if you are scheduling or taking parts of the exam, you'll just schedule one particular division or one particular part. You will sign up for it, you'll pay for it, you'll go take that part of the test, and then you'll get a score just for that part of the test. So you basically have to test 7 times. Now, if you wanted to schedule them one after another, you could do that. Most people don't do that. Most people study for a particular division and then take that part, and then they go to take the next one. Now, part of registering for and taking the ARE is that you need to identify a state board that you're going to kind of test under. Now, that doesn't mean that you have to test in that particular state. It just means that once you start the process of testing, your scores will be sent to a particular state board that you identify. Now, sometimes people aren't sure where they're going to go, so they might just contact the state board that they're currently living in, and maybe they plan on moving later. But the state board is important because if you don't identify a state board, it's tough to schedule the ARE. By that I mean, when you go to take the ARE, the testing center will say, well, what state board have you signed up with? Because each individual state will determine who is eligible to take the ARE. Now, some states, they'll say, you can take the test as soon as you're done with your NAB accredited degree, meaning as soon as you graduate with a NAB accredited degree, either BARC or MARC, then you can begin testing and begin taking the ARE. Some states will say you have to wait 6 months before you can begin taking the first division of the ARE. It really is up to the state board, so that's why it's important to sign up with the state board and then begin the testing process so that they're aware of you, they're not going to be surprised when they start receiving scores, and that you can make sure that you're eligible in that state to begin testing. Now, those rules have changed a lot in the last few years. When I was registered about 13 years ago, you had to complete IDP before you could begin testing. So that was actually a several year gap between graduation from a NAB accredited school and beginning to test. So typically it was like 3 to 5 years for most people before they could even begin testing, because you had to show that you had completed the internship component through IDP. So now, with being able to test in most places at or near graduation, it allows people to include the testing process as part of your internship. So you can be working your internship hours concurrently with taking the ARE. Now in Texas, the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners is the state board that regulates licensure of architects. And if you are in the state and you want to become eligible to take the ARE, you just contact the TBAE, and that's the Texas Board of Architectural Examiners. They will kind of assist you on all of the documents that they require and what they'd like you to do before you start testing. And so then you can register with them, and then once you do that, when you're in the test, then you just say, my scores will be sent to Texas, and then they will receive your scores, and then you actually get a letter from the TBAE when you pass or fail a portion of the exam. So your scores actually don't come from the testing center. They run those scores through your state board. So that's why it's important also to sign up with a state board, because they're actually the ones that tell you if you pass or fail a division of the ARE. So the eligibility to take the ARE, we discussed a little bit that the state board is the one who determines your eligibility, and because it's constantly changing, you want to make sure that you have all the proper documentation. You want to make sure that you can show that you have completed your degree. Some people don't have either their diploma or transcripts or documentation, so that's something that you need to start getting together if you're getting ready to take the ARE. They may require some other things like, birth certificate or something else. In Texas, they might at times they have required things like, official transcripts from your school, just to make sure that it shows that you've completed your degree. So every state is different, and it really just depends. And they'll make the rules for eligibility. In fact, when you contact NCARB, they really don't like to say, well, here's who can take the ARE, because they know that each state board makes those rules. So they just set up a contact person in each state where they say, okay, just contact the person in that state, and then they'll determine whether or not you're eligible, and then what they need to get from you in order for you to become eligible to test. Scheduling the exam is pretty easy because it's through the Prometric testing centers, and Prometric is all throughout the United States. They're in many cities in the US, and actually they have testing centers in England and Canada and Hong Kong and Abu Dhabi. So those are the places outside of the US where you could potentially take the exam. And scheduling is just really simple. You either go online or you call them. You say, I want to take this particular division of the ARE, and they, take your money and you set up a time, you show up, and then that's it. And usually it's in like a storefront or, kind of an office complex, and they have kind of a security setup where you come in, you show your ID, you might have to sign something. Some places they might take a fingerprint or something just so they can identify you, and then they have you put all your stuff in a locker. They make sure you don't have a phone or anything else on you, and then you go in and you take the test. And it's really unlike the old format of the test where everyone in the room was taking the ARE. Now, because it's at a testing center, the people next to you are probably going to be taking things like the LSAT or the GRE or GMAT or some other nationalized exam that's pretty different from the ARE. So you can schedule multiple portions of the test, but typically you can't take more than one in one day. I mean, I suppose you probably could, but several of the tests take many hours to complete, and so it may be that you can only do one per day, but most people space them out over several weeks or months because you will probably test after you have studied for that particular portion of the exam. The exam costs are shown right here, and they're pretty steep. The cost of the whole ARE for 7 divisions is $1,470. Now, if you take the individual divisions, they're $210, but here it says retakes are $210 also. That means if you fail a portion of the exam, you have to take it over and you have to pay the same exact fee. And so usually there's also a waiting period if you fail a portion of the exam. In some places, it's 6 months before you can take that portion again, so you can't go the next day and take it again. But each state determines how long you have to wait between a failing portion of the exam and the time that you can retake it. Now, because the cost is pretty expensive and people have avoided taking the exam just because of the cost, part of ARE 5.0 is going to be a reduced fee structure. There are some places that you can get financial assistance for taking the exam, but that's really up to your state. So in Texas, the TBAE offers an exam scholarship. You can apply to receive an exam scholarship, but they have very few of those. So it's a small portion of the population who wants to take the test that's going to be able to get assistance for it. Exam prep and preparation is like a lot of tests that are either for graduate school or, other nationalized exams. There are a lot of companies that offer review guides and review manuals for the test. There are courses that the AIA will periodically offer. There are exam prep test groups where people will get together and form study groups through the AIA, or for the emerging professionals groups in the AIA. So there are, all kinds of things that you can do. There are companies that make flashcards and prep videos, and lots of people have blogs where they'll post like YouTube videos on exam prep and things like that. But, depending on the division of the test, some people may study a little more, a little less, depending on, what they were good at in school potentially, or, how much they think they might need to study for a particular part of the test. The ARE 4.0 has 7 divisions. So when we talk about each individual division, they're really focused on individual topics that pertain to architecture in general. So some of the states will elect to have supplemental exams, meaning parts of a state exam perhaps that are beyond the ARE, but the ARE 4.0 really just focuses on those 7 parts. So if you have a state that decides to test on something additional, then that is not going to be part of the ARE, because the ARE is that national standardized exam. Some examples of where a state might test as a supplemental exam: Florida has a wind load exam that they use for hurricane design and things that are consistent with what they have to deal with in terms of architecture in their state. California actually has 2 supplemental exams. There is a seismic exam that has to deal with seismic issues as they pertain to buildings. That's a written exam. And then California also has an oral exam, which means they have you show up almost like a job interview. Usually there's a panel of 3 or 4 people in a room, and they can kind of ask you anything. They can ask you stuff that's on the ARE. They can ask you things about the seismic portion of the exam. So it's a pretty tough exam. A lot of people fail that portion of the exam and end up retaking it, but it's up to the state to test on whatever it is that they want to test on. So if they want to include the ARE, most do, but most have the ARE, and then if they want to test on something additional, they'll create their own supplemental state exam. the first part of the ARE, since there are 7 divisions, is construction documents and services. And I say it's the first part. That doesn't mean you have to take it as the first part. I just put it as the first part because that's how they list it out for NCARB. They kind of have these 7 sections, and it's almost arbitrary which one gets listed first. So this is just the order that we're discussing them in, but you don't have to take them in any particular order. And since they are isolated, discrete topics, you could take them, in all kinds of different orders. People think that they have some magical order that's going to help them pass one or another, but really it kind of doesn't matter. As long as you study for that portion of the exam, that's really what you need to be focused on. So this part of the exam, construction documents and services, really has to do with the process by which you're documenting an architectural project. So it could be kind of document structure questions, like what certain symbols mean, what process you would use for making a revision. So for example, on this drawing, this has a little cloud. It looks like a little bubble or cloud in the middle of the drawing. That's a revision cloud. So that may be a question on the ARE, like what is this, or how would you show a revision on a drawing? Some of them can get a bit more complicated in terms of formal documentation, talking about things that are related to construction and how you might show that, or maybe looking at complex details or construction techniques, and maybe it asks you what it's trying to show, or maybe there might be even a graphic portion of the exam. In older forms of the ARE, there were separate multiple choice sections and then separate graphic divisions. So in previous versions of the exam, you might have like the design portions as the graphic portions of the exam, and in the old paper exam many years ago, when it was everybody in one room drawing on a drafting table, then those graphic portions of the exam were completely separate, and then they'd have a multiple choice kind of bubble in the answer portion of the exam. When I took the exam about 15 years ago, it was 9 divisions, and 3 of them were graphic, and the other 6 were multiple choice and fill in the blank and things like that. Now, all of the 7 divisions are grouped together where each portion has a graphic element, meaning it might have you draw something on the computer or something else. Nothing is on paper, it's all in the computer and it's all digitized, but there is a graphic software that they use as a component of the ARE. Now, the graphic component is not a specific software like AutoCAD or something like that, and so you have to kind of learn the tools of what they're going to be using on the ARE, and they have study guides for that and that sort of thing, but it's very simplified. Most people any type of graphic architectural software have no problem operating that graphic portion. So on each of these divisions there's going to be at least a small, or in some cases maybe bigger portion that's graphic based instead of just asking multiple choice questions. The second division that we look at is programming, planning, and practice. And this talks about the programming portion in pre-design. So that could be, asking you anything about how you might read a program, how you might come up with a program. This is a matrix that would be included in a program. They might ask you some questions about something like that, like about diagrams and adjacencies, and an adjacency just means what room needs to be what next to what other room. What spaces need to be close to each other or far apart, and those are things that would be determined in programming. And if you remember from previous lectures, programming is just that portion of the project in the beginning in pre-design where you're going in and determining the client's or the owner's needs. So the planning and practice portion, that might have to do with just professional practice in architecture. Might ask you questions about procedural things in terms of like, the stakeholders in a project, like relationship of the architect to the client, you know, documentation for that, and other things that have to do with professional practice. Site planning and design, some of this might be more graphic based, and typically on the site planning and design portion of the project, there might be some multiple choice, but the graphic portions are going to have you work on a small site design project that give you a certain criteria. It might say, okay, here's a parking lot and we need to have this many parking spaces, but there are 15 trees on this site and you can't put a parking space where there's a tree, so you have to kind of lay it out, leaving the trees, and then you have to have a certain number of spaces between the parking spaces so that cars can drive around. So it'll give you this list of criteria, and then it's timed so that in that certain amount of time you have to fulfill all those criteria. Most of the time when people fail portions of the ARE, it's not that they're incompetent, certainly. It's typically that they either run out of time and they aren't able to fit all the criteria in a given amount of time, because it does go very fast, or maybe they left some questions blank, or whatever it is. But some of it even has to do with strategies for planning and designing, because you can't spend too much time messing around with one concept or another. It's almost like you have time to make a decision about the design that you're going to do and then implement that. Otherwise, you're going to run out of time. The fourth section that we focus on is building design and construction systems. A lot of this can be graphic potentially, and focusing on laying out different parts of a building, maybe looking at how a wall is constructed, or how individual portions of a building are laid out, or you may even be asked to lay out several floors of a building with certain criteria. So you have to kind of be prepared for anything. Now, most of the time, as far as the design portions are concerned, if you've had experience, through internship and working with several projects, you're not going to have too much trouble with the design portion. And even coming out of school, you've been working on design projects for several years, and so it's not like you have to wait until you've done a certain amount of internship to take it. But it does help having that experience both in school and even a little bit of internship experience. But there could be questions about materials. There could be questions about construction processes, but a lot, again, could focus on the building design element of the test. Structural systems tends to be everyone's favorite or least favorite, depending on who you talk to. If you really enjoyed structures in school and the calculations and all that good stuff, then you probably love this portion of the test. Some people who are a bit more design focused in school, not that you can be design focused and love structures, that's certainly can be the case, but structures tends to be more challenging, and the only reason I say that is because just factually this is typically the most failed portion of the exam. Traditionally, this has been the lowest pass rate, or the one that people need to retake the most, but it's not something to be afraid of or nervous about for most people. You just need to study, and typically the study materials help you do fine on the test. But structural systems will look at loads of a building. It will look at how the loads are affecting different parts of the building. We'll talk about lateral loads such as wind or seismic loads. It might talk about the difference between dead loads and live loads. Dead loads being the actual portion of the building itself, and live loads being kind of the movable parts within the building. Could be people, could be live loads also. But generally it just talks about the stresses that are put on a building and how the building might react to those, and just general conceptual things about the structural systems of a building. Building systems, this could be all kinds of things. It could be mechanical systems, electrical systems, even some issues of materiality, but all of those things that are contained within the building could be like conveying systems like elevators and escalators. So a lot of different categories could fall within building systems. But this might have to do with either the operation of them, the documentation of them, just how things work in general within the building, how they might interact with each other. And so this is really talking about all those systems that get contained within the building that serve different functions and serve like all of the functions of the building when it's completed. Schematic design, this is kind of the early portion of design of the project. Schematic design is typically going to be heavily graphic, and so it's going to ask you to maybe lay out certain spaces or identify certain things design-wise within a project. And because there are standardized projects that are presented in the exam, it's typically going to be written in a way where, working on one type of building or another is not going to give you an advantage necessarily. It's going to be fairly universal in terms of general architectural principles that are going to be applied to a specific project. If you are asked to design certain things, those same criteria are going to be applied to everyone, and then you're graded based on whether or not you fulfill those criteria in the thing that you lay out or that you design. So once you have taken each of the divisions of the ARE, you'll get your exam results through your state board. So typically you're going to receive your results through your state board, and they may post them or typically send you a letter. You might be able to check a central website that they have online. Each state is going to be different, so it's hard to say exactly how you get your exam results, but since they pass through the state board, that's who's going to determine or send you whether you passed or failed. And again, it goes by division, so it's possible to pass one division and then fail the next one, or pass the next one, fail the next one. So it really just depends. Now, depending on when you started taking your exams, most states have what they call the rolling clock, and that's also through NCARB. So if you look at your NCARB login, for example, or your NCARB record, it might tell you, okay, here's how much time you have left on the rolling clock. Usually the rolling clock is from the time you take your first exam till the time that you pass your last exam. It should be less than 5 years, or 5 years is kind of the maximum. Now, if you don't pass all the divisions within 5 years, then all your exam results go away and you have to start taking the divisions over. So there's a real incentive to try and finish within those 5 years. But often that's why people might wait to take the first one. Maybe they don't start taking it right after graduation, but it all depends. Now, if you took all of them, you could conceivably pass all of them before you finish IDP. That would be fine. And then whenever you finish IDP or your internship requirement, then you apply to become registered. And so, that's why that whole area of internship, examination, and registration is all kind of fluid because everybody's different. Nobody takes the same amount of tests at the same time. Nobody takes the same amount of time to take all of the tests. But that rolling clock applies to everybody. Now, your state might have different, I guess, requirements. So there are some requirements at the national level, or exceptions, I guess, at the national level and sometimes at the state level, where if you have had like active military service, like you got called up within your 5 years, some states will allow the birth or adoption of a child. They'll give you 6 months. But, typically in the big scheme of things, 6 months doesn't add a whole lot to your time to study and time to take the test. So most people are trying to do it fairly quickly. Now that doesn't seem like a short amount of time, 5 years, but when you're working, and let's say you're working in an architecture office and you're working not 40 hours a week, maybe you're working 50, 60, 70 hours a week, especially during your internship, then finding the time to study and take the exams can be pretty difficult. So a lot of time can go by without you even studying at all, and then you find yourself figuring out how you're going to take these 7 tests in kind of a short amount of time. Now, when we look at the years between the first division taken and exam completion, this graphic is kind of trying to encourage candidates to look at this and say, okay, well, if I have a shorter amount of time between the first exam I take and the last exam I take, then my pass rates are going to be significantly higher. And I think that's actually improved a lot, though, because they have allowed people to take the test right after graduation, where there were those years when you had to wait until IDP was complete before you could even start taking your exams. The pass rates were really low because clearly people had spent a lot of time away from school and away from kind of studying those topics and the exam environment. And so that's helped push up pass rates quite a bit. Now, if we look at specific pass rates, you can look up pass rates for the last several years. These are pass rates in all of the different divisions. It also shows how many people took the exam. So a lot more people took the exam in 2014 than they did in kind of the recession years, 2010, 2012, certainly, and you can see that start to kind of tick up a little bit with, the economy being much better. Now, in some of these, the structural portion has improved quite a bit in the last few years, and things like building design and construction systems is a bit lower pass rate. Now, it kind of depends. Like I look at 2014, construction documents and programming were really low. So it kind of depends on what years the test was taken and who was taking the test and what the candidates' aptitudes were. But it looks like in more recent years that programming, planning, and practice was a pretty low pass rate, and so was construction documents and services. Now, some of that might even have to do with programming and practice maybe not being as emphasized in your working life or in school, and so that may be something that has to be studied for and perhaps leads to a bit lower pass rate. But you can see that even overall, the pass rates are not super high. I mean, less than 3/4 of people typically pass any one division. Now, the last and kind of final capstone portion of the whole process is registration. And most of the time people think, well, if I passed all my tests, I've finished internship, doesn't that mean I'm registered? And the answer is, well, not really. There's very little you have left to do after that if you have completed all of the components of IDP and you've passed all the portions of the ARE and your state exam, if any. By the way, there are no state exam portions required in Texas beyond the ARE. So the ARE, if it's completed, that's accepted as the examination portion for Texas. But for registration, the idea is that you need to kind of commit to a member board or a jurisdiction or a state board, and that will allow them to kind of process your request for registration. So when we look at this, when we talk about member boards, typically that has to do with the state in which you would like to be registered. Now, that may be the state that you had all your exam scores sent to, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. If you then decide to take all your scores and your pass results and take them to a different state, you can do that. And you may be in the process of moving or something, you could potentially do that. When it talks about a jurisdiction, the jurisdiction is just whatever state or area you're applying to for registration. They're the ones that decide what the rules for registration are. So they may have some kind of strange or unique requirements. So for example, in Texas, they recently passed a requirement where if you become registered, or even if you are a registered architect, you have to go get fingerprinted. So this is just like a new state requirement, and that started last year. So they have all these kind of documentation and procedural requirements, and each state is going to be different. Now the main thing that happens though is they assign you a number. And you see this seal, which is the architect's seal. This is the stamp or the seal that you're going to use on all your drawings and all your documents from now on. And it'll have some specific requirements that the state will have. Usually it'll have the name of the state. It might have a certain style, but it'll typically say registered architect, your name, and then it will have the number that they assign to you. Most states, they have consecutive numbering, so you can see whatever number you are, that's that number of architect that's ever been registered in the state since they've been keeping registration records. Now, initial registration or registration by examination is what we refer to as, the first time you're ever becoming registered in a state or jurisdiction. And I say or jurisdiction because they're still like, Puerto Rico, Guam, Washington, D.C., Virgin Islands, so it may not be a state. But wherever you decide to become initially registered, you're becoming registered because you passed the examination and you completed the exam and you're becoming registered for the first time. So we often refer to this as registration by examination. Or initial registration or initial licensure. There are still some places where you could potentially become registered by being grandfathered in by experience. Now, I have heard that there are those places. I could not locate where those places are, like through accurate reporting and documentation. So most places it's going to be just the initial registration process, typically involving NAB accredited education, internship, IDP requirements completed, and the ARE passed and any state exam passed. Now, this is a graphic that the NCARB put out this year that said 33.3 years of age was the average age at initial licensure, and it said this is down 2.7 years since 2008. So apparently they're really excited about this, but this seems, like a really long time to be waiting until licensure. Now, part of that has to do with many people who were in the pipeline to become registered. Once the recession hit, around 2008, they decided to postpone taking the exams. They're really expensive. It takes a lot of time. Perhaps they got laid off from their job and it stopped their internship. So what we're seeing this year, and with that rise in people taking the exam, is that many more people have come back into the profession. There are a lot more jobs now, and they're completing the steps for licensure. So I think that's just kind of like a leveling effect of the economy coming back. Registration by reciprocity means that if you have a license in a U.S. state or jurisdiction and you want to become registered in another state, it doesn't mean that you have to go back and take the ARE again. If you've fulfilled the requirements for registration in one state, you can apply for what we call reciprocity. Now, you could do that if you have all your state requirements completed and you want to apply to that other state. Usually it's going to be a lot easier if you have an NCARB council record. Now, an NCARB council record just means that NCARB has all of your documentation, and they have verified that you passed all the divisions of the ARE and IDP and all of that, and you maintain your council record year to year, and you pay a fee to them every year. And if you have that council record, then they will help you apply for reciprocity. It makes it a bit easier to apply in a different state. Now, most of the time people think, well, I'm not going to move, so why do I need an NCARB council record, or why do I need to apply for reciprocity? And it's not really if you yourself are going to go live in another state. I mean, it could be, if you decide to move, you could apply for reciprocity in that state. But if you get a project and it's in another state, you need to be registered in that state in order to become the architect of record on that project. And so when we talk about licensure and registration, it goes by where the project location is. So I'm registered in Texas, but I'm not registered in Louisiana. But if I got a project in New Orleans and I want to be the architect of record on it, then I need to apply for reciprocity before I stamp and seal and submit drawings on that project or any documentation on that project, for example, and I need to be registered prior to that project happening. So some architects, if they don't want to do that, they may partner with a local architecture firm, and they might be the design architect, and then the architect who is registered in that state might be what we call the architect of record. So it kind of depends on the requirements of the project, but if you want to be the architect on that project, like known as the architect of record, then you need to be registered or licensed in that state.